Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Joseph Topol's play, Cat on the Rails. This is another one of those plays where I'm not sure whether it's a translation issue, whether this was a play that I think premiered in, I want to say the 60s, 1964, and that was just the style of theater, or if just for whatever reason my brain is not putting this together. But this is another one of those plays that feels very disjointed to me, even at the level of you have bits and pieces of dialogue that individually make sense, but then you get transitions to a new bit of dialogue that seems completely unconnected in any way from what's been going on before. And so it jumps in a way that I don't really follow. And I often encounter this in plays in translation, and so I think it might be an issue of one of the challenges of translation is how close do you stick to the original language versus how much do you attempt to recreate what the original playwright or author is doing in the language you're translating it into, right? Because those are not always the same proposition. Something that makes sense as a connected idea in Czech may not make sense as connected ideas in English. And so Topol's play may be much more coherent than it reads to me because I'm reading it in translation, and I genuinely don't know, in part because I don't read or speak Czech, and so I have no way of verifying one way or another. But the play seems to me to be very, very disjointed. But this also seems to me like a play that may be taking inspiration from Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. This is a play in which not much really happens, and Waiting for Godot was famously described by a critic as a play in which nothing happens twice. In Cat on the Rails, you have 5 characters, technically. You have Evie and Vina. These are our 2 main characters with whom we spend most of our time. You have the boy, you have the first young man, and the second young man. Now, the plot lines for the boy and the young men are pretty easy to explain. The boy is trying to escape from these 2 young men because the boy is romantically pursuing the sister of the first young man, who has been promised, I guess, to the second young man. So they're trying to catch the boy and beat him up for this. The boy is trying to evade them. In the course of this pursuit and attempt to evade the pursuit, they run into this whistle-stop train station, which is where the play is set. And they find there Evie and Vina, who are these 2 youngish lovers. Evie has some kind of job, I forget what it is, and she's been offered a promotion, basically, where she would be more in a sort of customer service role. Vina is a mover. But that's not really that important to the play. Basically, the play involves them at this whistle stop waiting for a train and just sort of talking about things. Some things that seem quite significant, some things that seem quite banal. And this is really where it feels to me very, very Godot-esque, right? Because in Godot, you have Vladimir and Estragon, Didi and Gogo, who sit around on the side of a road waiting for Godot, and they kill time by talking about random stuff. Now, in this play, in Cat on the Rails, you do, of course, have a different dynamic, because whereas Didi and Gogo are friends, Evie and Vina are lovers. What exactly that commitment means and how exactly that commitment is seen by each of them is a subject of discussion during the play. But it's not really resolved. Nothing really gets resolved. There's a whole set of things that they touch on. Their relationship, the relationship between Evie and Vina's mom, all of these different things. They debate whether or not a particular shadow is a cloud or a pine tree. Just this range of random stuff. They talk about their dreams, they talk about their hopes, but they don't really sort of say anything particularly concrete. Again, at least not in this translation. But one of the things that I do find really interesting is this one particular section where they're sort of playing this game, almost. This game with language. And it's a game based around the idea that the world is constructed linguistically. That by the use of language, the world itself is built. Now, there is a sort of biblical component to this in the whole Adam and Eve are charged with naming all of the animals. In the beginning was the Word, which in some interpretations, some theological interpretations, indicates that the Word of God is the creative force of the universe, the Logos in Greek. Some people disagree about that, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes here. But there's also this element of there's a psychoanalytic component to this idea, because Jacques Lacan, the famous French psychoanalyst of the mid-20th century, one of his famous precepts is that the unconscious is structured like a language. And so even if that's not a question of the objective world is constructed through language, the world as it is perceived within the human brain is constructed through language. And so they play this game that's premised on building Vina through language. And there is a sort of digression here, but I want to read this bit to you so you get a sense of how this game is being played. Because I think this is kind of central to the play as I understand it, which is probably not a great understanding. So Evie says, "What do you want to be all your life?" Vina lies back again and thinks for a moment. What's a not too dirty a word meaning the opposite of virtuous? Yeah, the grammar there is slightly odd, and I assume that is a translation issue. Evie says shameless. Vina says shameless. That's what I want to be. Vina shameless. Silence. Evie leans over him. Evie plays with his hand. Still, you could have cleaned your nails. Vina says, sometimes I get the feeling that if I really concentrated, I could be what I want to be. Evie says, a demon? Venus says, maybe a demon. He rises. I'll go and concentrate, all right? Evie, with a sigh, says, go ahead. Venus says, I'm serious. Evie says, hurry up. Train may be here any minute. She glances at him. Venus stands a few steps away, covering his eyes. What do I do? Venus says, you must keep quiet. Evie says, is that the only way? Venus says, that's why there are no demons nowadays. That's why they walk only nights and in desert places. Uncovers his eyes but keeps them shut. I'm ready. Evie softly says, what's it going to be? Vina, in a fuller voice than before, I have negated myself. I am nothing. I am blotted out. Evie, in a whisper, says, blotto. Vina says, shh. I'm yet to be created. You may address me now, and the way you address me, that's what I'll be. That's what you'll make me. It'll all depend on what you use to call me out of the dark. Remember, it is just like when the first man saw a lump of matter in front of him and called it tree. Evie frivolously says, or cloud. Vina says, or rock. So you better bloody watch out how you evoke me. Evie looks at him intently. Vina's eyes are closed. Well, Evie, after a beat, my angel. Vina opens his eyes in disgust. Oh, get lost. Is that all you could think of? Evie says, you shouldn't have made that face. Vina says, I didn't make an angel face, did I? Evie says, a little Vina face. I had to say something sweet to you. Vina says, what do I do now? Float? Something sweet? Women are crazy for puddings. Evie says, try again. Vina says, I can't concentrate now. You were supposed to create the world. Evie says, I can see the mess you would make of the world. You could never think of anything as tender as a finch, and all your trees would look alike. I know you. Vina says, powerful and gnarled. Evie says, no snowball bushes, no meadow sweet. Vina says, platypuses and otters, sewer rats and lizards, orangutans and mastodons, rhinos and anteaters, and instead of rose bushes, one great thorn piercing the heavens. Evie says, and gliding above the desolation there'd be my angel. He'd make it that way on purpose, to be sure he would stand out. Vina says, that's always been my ambition. So, I think this is very interesting. And I think it gets toward what this play might be doing, again, as I understand it. Especially this idea of the way you address me, that's what I'll be, and that's what you'll make me. It'll all depend on what you use to call me out of the dark. I think that's really interesting because in a certain way, this is a kind of analysis of theater, right? There's almost a meta-theatrical quality to this because when on the stage we call someone Hamlet or Antigone or Julius Caesar or whoever, whatever character, they're supposed to become that character, right? So when an actor who is not John Proctor, for instance, is called John Proctor in Arthur Miller's The Crucible, that actor becomes John Proctor, is made to be John Proctor by that mode of address. And there's a tremendous creative power in that. And I think that's part of the reason why in this play nothing really happens, why there's nothing that actually occurs. There's really no plot. There's no, I would say, very little coherent character development. We get bits and pieces of things because it's a constant exploration of who these characters can be made to be through the address of the other.